Welcome. I'm Brian O'Keefe, the Deputy Editor of Fortune and the Editorial Director of Fortune Brainstorm AI, our conference that is scheduled for November 8th and 9th, 2021 in Boston in person. So I hope we can all get vaccinated and see each other and see what it's like to get back into a big room together and have deep discussions, as great as it is to talk on Zoom. But I'd like to extend a big thank you to Accenture for being our presenting partner, both of today's event and the conference in Boston. We're very grateful to Accenture for working with us on this event, which we're very excited about. And today is actually the continuation of a series of Brainstorm AI virtual events that are leading up to the conference in November. We hope you'll join us for the additional events as well. So I'm very excited to get into the discussion today, but before we get into it with our esteemed panelists, I have a few housekeeping notes. Today's gathering is on the record and will be covered by Fortune journalists. We'd love to have audience questions, and you can enter those in the chat function. The moderator will be monitoring that and will do his best to get as many of your questions into the conversation as possible. And you should also know that these discussions are much richer when all of you chime in and participate. We really want this to be an interactive conversation. We have some great business leaders here to talk about our topic today, but we want to really mix it up and get everybody involved. So with that, I'll hand things over to Fortune senior writer Jeremy Kahn, who's joining us from London. Take it away, Jeremy.
Great, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate having you all with us today. Today's conversation is about bias and the battle to make AI responsible, a big topic, no doubt. But we have a great panel of experts, so without further ado, let's dive straight in. I want you to meet our experts. We have Rana El-Koulibaly, the CEO of Effectiva, the Honorable Catherine Forrest, who's a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, Danny Gillory, Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Dropbox, Ritika Gunnar, who's the Vice President, Cloud and Cognitive Experts Lab, and Shail Jain, who's the Global Lead Data and AI at Accenture. And we'll kick it right off. I guess you hear a lot about AI ethics and responsible AI, and very often you have companies coming out with a set of principles or announcing they're signing up to somebody else's set of principles, whether that's the Montreal Charter or the Vatican even has a set of these principles. But it's quite another thing to try to actually put this into practice, I think. So I want to start this off by asking our panelists, how do you operationalize the fight against AI bias? How do you put in place procedures and policies that can kind of turn these AI ethics principles into reality? And I'm going to start this off by asking this to Danny, because I know at Dropbox, you guys have created this thing called a Product Diversity Council. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that works?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And I just want to thank you and Fortune for the invitation. It's great being with such an esteemed group of people. A couple things I'll say just to frame it. I think we don't want to forget, and everybody here will talk about this also, that where it always starts is with the team and with the training data. So let's not lose sight of the fact that we probably wouldn't be having this discussion to the same extent if teams that were developing AI were diverse and if the data sets were wide. So I think that's important kind of as framing, and everybody else I think will talk more about that. At the same time, we also recognize that it's a process to try and actually embed really exploring and kicking the tires on AI from a diversity standpoint. And so what we did at Dropbox was we started what you referred to as a Product Diversity Council, where we invited volunteers from our employee resource groups, trained them in divergent thinking, and then actually had them analyze certain products at a certain point in the product development cycle with a set of diversity questions and frameworks to kind of start their thinking. And then what we would do is have a facilitated process afterward to get their feedback. It was really enlightening as we did it. We did 2 pilot rounds last year and are figuring out right now how to make it something that sticks long term and it really is operationalized. But I think there are 3 key elements that you want to think about when doing something like this. One is thinking about when in a product development cycle you want to analyze for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So products can be too early sometimes where they don't know enough about it. to actually ask questions. They wouldn't even know what to ask, or it could be too late, where if you start to ask questions, you can't really do anything about it. The product is already 99% done and almost out the door. So figuring out that window in terms of when to analyze a product from a diversity standpoint is important. The second thing, and this is probably the most crucial element, is having the buy-in of product managers. So I don't know about other companies, but within Dropbox, product managers are the ones who really guide a product throughout its development cycle. So if they're not invested, it's not going to go anywhere. So to operationalize this long term, I think for us, we're looking at a process of really educating our different product managers so that it becomes regular practice in terms of how they do work, rather than this external thing that was done. The third thing I'll just mention is the triggering mechanism. So in product and software development cycles, there are different triggering mechanisms for when I have to do things, when I have to do a privacy review or other types of things like that. And so what is your triggering mechanism to do that? And so for us, we've been working closely with our legal department to develop a time when somebody who's a product manager would say, yes, I think I need to submit this to a diversity review. So those are three elements, I think, that as you're building something like this out, become really important. I will just say this, is that to really operationalize this takes getting into the guts and into the detail. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that from what some of the other panelists have done with their organizations.
Great, Danny, thanks so much. I want to turn to Catherine next. You've dealt with this in the kind of criminal justice context, and I know you've talked a bit about how you kind of do testing of data and how you test algorithms in that context. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how you kind of go from principles in that sphere to practice?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And I also want to thank you and Fortune for having me today. And it's just a real honor to be speaking on a panel with all of you. And let me sort of start by giving folks in the audience a sense as to how I even come to have any expertise in this area. I was a judge in the federal system from 2011 until 2018. And have a separate interest, and I've had a long-standing interest in artificial intelligence, and so have been working and writing quite a bit in this area. So the issue that you're asking about in terms of how to operationalize it is actually a very complicated one, because the first thing that we have is a data issue. And I very much take Danny's point, which is you've got to have a wide and diverse data set. But in the criminal justice context, data can actually be a huge source of the problem. And when we're looking at the utilization of AI tools in connection with liberty-based decisions. And what I'm talking about is the utilization of software, which is done right now all over the country. There are a number of companies that have made some very sophisticated machine learning-based AI tools that make and assist those in the justice system in making decisions about bail, about sentencing, about where in correctional housing somebody should be placed, and then about the programs that might assist an individual in terms of reduction of recidivism. So the data set that is used for all of these tools is only as good as our history is. And so we have, I think, in this country, a set of historical circumstances that differ by era, differ by geography, and change depending upon where we are. And we have some structural inequalities that are built into that data that are frankly very difficult to get away from. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge the limitations of the data and to understand what the data, what kinds of channels it puts us within, and what we need to do, if anything, depending upon what the outcome goal is, to try to adjust for it if adjustment is appropriate. So so understanding the data set and the data implications is very important. And that can be done really with putting a task force together, which has been done in a variety of places, to understand not only what is the training set that is used, but what is the set that is being looked at on an ongoing basis. So, for instance, if you've taken a data set from New York City in the 1990s, and you have a viewpoint that there has been the stop and frisk policies were in place, and that there was an over arrest of certain individuals, people of color, then that data set will be reflective of those policing policies. So an accurate data set, even a very large data set, could end up capturing certain structural and historical realities. So you have to understand that. So understanding your data, which can be done with a task force, is critical. The second thing that is critical is understanding your validation. Every tool that is created has been validated in its own particular way. There is no national set of guidelines right now for the validation of the software that's used in the criminal justice area. There are accepted tolerances, if you will, as to what kinds of validation are acceptable, but on a state level and on the federal level, what kind of validation is acceptable is different. So there needs to be an understanding. Again, this can be done with a task force and with education as to what kind of validation is expected and is appropriate. And that will help us operationalize, if you will, some of our goals, because if the validation is lower than or different from, in many ways, what our goals are in terms of an acceptable level of accuracy, then that's very important for us to know. And that helps us operationalize some of our principles, because we can have principles out there, but if the validation is falling short and known to be falling short, then we need to actually undertake some adjustments. The other piece that I would put in there is education. And this is one that can be operationalized in a relatively straightforward manner. What I have learned, and I've just done a book on this topic called When Machines Can Be Judge, Jury, and Executioners, what I've learned is that many of the users of these tools don't necessarily understand exactly, number one, what the structural limitations are of the data sets, two, what the validation even means, and by the way, who made the choices for some of the algorithmic choices that went into it. So educating the users can help us then in the criminal justice area actually operationalize this, because if the users understand the limitations, they can adjust for how much reliance they place on what they might otherwise deem to be evidence-based decision-making tools. So those are some things that I would sort of start with, Jeremy.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. I want to bring in a few of our other guests here today. Ritika, what do you guys do, and what do you advise some of your customers to do in terms of some of these issues around taking something from AI principles to actually putting that into practice in a way that creates kind of responsible AI?
Thank you, Jeremy. I think the feedback that Danny and Catherine had is so relatable to what we see with our clients. You know, when I work with thousands of clients across every industry across the world, when it comes to building trust in AI, there are three key questions that we always get. Is my AI fair? Is it explainable? Is it protected? And I will say the fourth one that is becoming extremely prominent is it accountable? If you think about, to be able to scale AI and to be able to have it be trusted and be able to put in production in a way where you want to be able to see it, from a technology perspective, you want to make sure you have tools that are going to enable fairness and detect bias and mitigate that bias in AI. You want to be able to explain when AI is making decisions, how it's doing that in a non-technical way, such that business people can really understand that. How you can actually secure and protect the data and insights that are codified in those models. And of course, this last one that we're seeing become a lot more prominent, which is how can you ensure that clients can trace all AI decisions back to that data source? Because we know that without good data, you can't have good AI. So that trusted data and data source back to a model is extremely important. These capabilities need to be codified in three areas. And I think that Danny and Catherine kind of touched on this. They need to be codified in the technology that's being used and the processes and the policies that you have across your organization and in the skills that you develop, and not just for the data scientists in the organization, across the organization. And so the framework that we provide is really, how do you take those four things and put that into accountability in the technology, in the policy and processes across the organization, and in the skills that you develop across the organization, really simply. And I think that kind of codifies, I think, what we've seen earlier as well from some of the teams. And we see it with all of our clients across every different industry, that's really simply how we can kind of codify that.
Great, thank you so much, Ritika. Shail, how about you guys at Accenture? What are you seeing in this area? And do you agree with what Ritika has just said? To unmute yourself, Shail.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with pretty much everything that has been said, and also thank you for having me on this panel. So we are advising our clients more and more about ethics of AI. As companies are becoming more and more data-driven, they are realizing that the speed at which the AI technology is advancing is really much faster than the speed with which organizations are adapting the AI ethics dilemma, if you will. And so what we are helping clients do is establish a very comprehensive responsible AI framework, which really has 4 components. First of which is operational, which is to set up a governance framework that involves laying out policies, also your risk tolerance profile, risk assessment, impact assessment, assessing the impact of the AI, and then having an accountable and responsible, like Ritika said, processes in place. Then the second piece is technical. So the good news is there's a lot of advancements in technology today where you can detect bias in data as well as bias in algorithms as you build it, and also over time as drift happens. And Ritika can talk about that because IBM is one of the leaders in that realm. The third one is organizational, where you have to make sure that in this world you have the right skills. You have the right diversity in place as well, because we've talked about data, and as Danny was talking about, diversity is very important. So diversity in data, but also diversity in teams that are working with data is important.
Great, Shail. I want to turn to Rana now. I mean, Affectiva, you're a fast-growing company, fast-growing AI company. I think sometimes companies that are smaller, that are fast-growing, they feel like I don't have time for this. This is a lot of procedures. It sounds like a lot of bureaucracy. How have you addressed it at Affectiva?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. And this is an open invitation to everybody who's joining to join us at the inaugural Fortune Brainstorm AI event, hopefully in Boston in November, where I'm based. So looking forward to that. So we're on a mission to humanize technology at Affectiva by building artificial emotional intelligence, or human perception AI. So essentially we use computer vision, machine learning, deep learning on tons and tons of data to build software that understands what humans do and how humans feel. And you may have all seen in the news over the last 2 years or so that facial recognition systems have been found to be quite biased. And if you look at the panelists on this call, there's a high likelihood that that facial recognition technology wouldn't work on somebody that looks like me. And that's obviously a problem, right? Because you take these technologies, you deploy them at scale, and before you know it, you have exasperated biases that exist in society. So the way we think about it is, and operationalize it as a company, is first of all, what Danny said, we have to be super intentional about it. It's hard for a startup with like competing milestones and yeah, it is tough, but I've made it a point that it's tied to our bonus as an executive team, and that kind of trickles down the organization. The way we think about it is across the machine perception pipeline. So everything starting from data acquisition to data annotation, how we train the algorithms, how we look at the validation and the accuracy results. 15 to 20 years ago, when I was a PhD student at Cambridge, you would just look at one accuracy score for your classifiers. That's no longer good enough. You have to break it down by subpopulation so that you're able to uncover these potential biases. So we map it out across the pipeline, and we make it a point to kind of put a deep lens on each step in the process to make sure that we're not introducing bias in the system. But at the end of the day, it falls down to the diversity of the team that's designing these algorithms and that's kind of, involved in the deployment of the algorithms. One example that I'll share, so we work in the automotive industry, and the use case there is detecting driver fatigue and distraction and drowsiness. One of our kind of automaker partners is a big luxury automotive brand in Europe. And so they sent us a data set. It was a proof of concept, and they said, okay, we're going to test the accuracy of your algorithms. We're going to send you a data set, analyze it, send us back the results. And we took a look at the data set, and it was literally like 20 to 25-year-old blonde, blue-eyed guys driving these vehicles around. And so we had as a small company a choice, right? We could process the data. It would look great. The results would be awesome. Send it back, end of the day, check. Or we looked at this and we were like, this is not representative of their client base. They're a kind of a global automaker. So we sent the data back and we said, you know what, this is no good. We need to collaborate on a more diverse data set. And we did that. And, it was more expensive, obviously, and it took a lot longer, but I think it was the right thing to do. And it was not intentional on their side. It was just, again, an oversight. And this is where literacy and education and evangelism becomes really key. And, everybody on this call has a responsibility to, educate the market because it's so new. So.
Great. So thanks, Rana. And also probably diverse teams matter there too, because I imagine that global automaker, whoever could put that data set together, probably was a bunch of, Scandinavian-looking white men between the ages of 20 and 30. And they probably thought, oh, it looks fine to us. I want to encourage everyone listening to please, if you have questions, to ask them in the chat, and we'll take some of those in a little bit. Now, Rana, you bring up an interesting point, which is, a lot of the panelists have emphasized, it's all about the data. You have to go back to the data, validate the data, figure out, understand the provenance of the data, understand what your data is. But, I wonder if there's also, and Shail touched on this a little bit, and Catherine touched on this a little bit, if there's a broader question that needs to be asked, that if possible, in some cases, maybe you can build a system, the data is fine, it performs well, the outcome of that given algorithm, seems equal across diverse groups, and yet the use case in which that's going to be deployed could be problematic ethically. And I know, Rana, I think when we were talking before, you said at Affectiva, for instance, you guys have decided you're just not going to get involved in the whole surveillance market. Is that right? And can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Correct. I think the conversation so far, in my opinion, has been focused on the ethical development of these AI algorithms and the data underlying it. But the other piece of the equation is the ethical deployment of these AI systems. So we as a company have put together some core values that guide our decision on which markets and which business opportunities do we take on board and which do we decline. So over the last 10 or so years, we've been approached by the venture fund of an intelligence agency to give us $40 million on condition that we pivot to the surveillance and lie detection market. We've turned that down, even when it kind of was existential for Affectiva. And we routinely get interest from, other governments to deploy the technology in this way. And I think because we're not there in terms of thoughtful regulation, we're not there in terms of accuracy or privacy considerations, we just basically turn this business away. I don't,
Yeah, and Shail, maybe that goes to the reputational piece that you were speaking about a little bit at the end. Is that something you talk about your clients, but don't get so focused on, the how that you forget about the big why question or the who question that you need to ask. You should unmute yourself, Shail, again.
Yeah, absolutely. Responsible AI is really all about good intentions. So it's really important for you to realize that it's about having good intentions to empower people and businesses to make a fair impact on customers and communities. And you really got to look at the very core of the company, which is your mission, your purpose, and your brand value. So if you are making sure that you put a governance process in place that does the assessment of impact you're having to the people, to the societies? And is that commensurate? Is that in alignment with your principle as a company, is your mission and vision, purpose of the company as well? And I think as long as you have processes in place to look at that, and again, I believe that having some external review board is very important, because as humans, we are biased. We are subject to bias. We get biased easily as well. So having some independent board, and it's actually even becoming a board level responsibility. Corporate governance is taking on the ethical governance responsibility as well. So I think all of those things go into making sure that you have good intentions as you're deploying AI, like Rana was just saying.
Yeah, Ritika, how about you guys at IBM? Have you had debates about this internally?
Well, of course, we've had debates about this internally. I mean, I think most of you know that in the middle of the summer, we pulled a lot of our facial recognition technology from the market because we wanted to make sure that our technology is used for good and it adheres to our trust and transparency principles that not only we have, but we encourage our clients as they're developing their AI practices to be able to be able to drive. So, you know, IBM absolutely supports the precision regulation of AI. And I think that starts kind of with individual organizations realizing their responsibility to have their own targeted policies that increase how companies develop and operate that trustworthy AI. Just think about it for a moment, like the amount of AI that is going to be in the market. I mean, AI is at this point where it is ubiquitous in nature. It is going to be everywhere. And there probably is going to be no one size fits all kind of policy that can accommodate all the different characteristics and use cases that happen. And most organizations probably don't have the experience. So I think back to Shell's point, not only having the right policies, but the right boards and frameworks so that you can have the right accountability in an organization to provide guidance on how you incubate the use case, how you develop your AI, how you put it in production, how those models are used for maybe use cases that it wasn't initially intended for is extremely important. And that requires, I think one of the other points that was mentioned, a different set of skills that people just have not yet been completely enabled on. So having these frameworks of boards with the right policies are going to be important. And that way you understand like how technology is deployed. Is it deployed in a way where you can see that being used for good? Is the technology that you're deploying in the AI fair and is it secure? I think it becomes extremely important to not only as a technology organization have these capabilities ourselves and aligned by a lot of the policies and the trust and transparency components that we've put together, but we feel a responsibility to make sure that we guide our customers, our clients, external organizations on the way to be able to do that as well.
Great, thanks. I want to we're getting some good questions in the chat, and I'm going to get to those in just one second. On this, Danny, I wanted to ask you, is part of that the conversation that product development group is going to have, if somebody raises their hand and says, actually, I don't think we should build this product, that could be a pretty uncomfortable conversation. And maybe you've had some of those conversations in these groups. What is that like, and how is that handled at Dropbox?
Yeah, so we haven't gotten to that point yet. And it brings up an interesting question, because I think as we talk about policies, one of the things that we also we're going to have to do is dig down into the less kind of obvious use cases. And that's one of the things that we found was more of a challenge to begin with in getting the Product Diversity Council started. Sometimes you don't, in a product that seems to be somewhat agnostic in terms of its impact on people, you're not even sure necessarily what questions to ask. One of the things we found was that in products and features that we were developing where we did this exploration, we started to uncover some things like really where the diversity issue was around personally identifiable information versus an actual typical kind of dramatic impact like you see in the examples that Catherine talks about in her book. I mean, those are really, these are much more subtle. And I think what we're going to find as we do this work is that it's going to be the subtle ones that are harder to find, but will probably lay the seeds for the types of challenges that you talk about that need to be picked out early. And so that's why I think we're at a real inflection point here. We're fortunate that this discussion about bias in AI has started now, where it's still relatively young, and that there's an opportunity to build things into processes before we're trying to retroactively fix things like we have to do with some of the criminal justice applications that Catherine has talked about and other things. So I think there's a real opportunity. The other thing I'll just mention is that, if people want to kind of look into a little bit more detail on this process, because I knew this was going to come up today, I just wrote a quick blog on it on LinkedIn in terms of the process where people can see actually a little bit more of the detail in terms of how we train people and everything else that may be helpful. But we haven't had to face that yet. I hope we don't. That'll be a tough discussion, Jeremy, and one that I hope to avoid if we can start to take these learnings and apply them also in other places. So that's the other thing, is I think we as a group need to really share and open source what we're learning, because I can tell you when I was trying to start this Product Diversity Council, I didn't see anything out there. I tried to find some model for it and couldn't find anything. So I think ideally there would be some place where we could share these resources about how we're doing things, because it's really just new territory.
Great, thanks, Danny. And maybe you could put that blog link in the chat. That would be great. Then people can see it there. I'm going to go to some of the questions we're getting in the chat. Jose Lopez Reynoso, I hope I haven't completely butchered your name, asks, should ethics on AI be regulated by a government agency, or should it emerge by a company, coalition, association? Catherine, what do you think about this? I mean, you've got experience in law and in government. Is there a role for government regulation here?
Well, the first thing I would say is that AI right now is touching literally every industry and every aspect of our life. And so it's very difficult to imagine a one-size-fits-all kind of government regulation. Indeed, some of what we're talking about here today, there are certain AI applications that don't involve particular issues of ethics or bias. If you're thinking of your Nest thermometer, that's one thing. If you're thinking of facial recognition, that's something else. If you're thinking of a kind of criminal recidivism software, that's something else. And so where there's human discretionary decision making, that's where a lot of this comes into play, where a human might themselves actually exercise discretionary decision making. But can the government do it? My view is, with every new technology, there is difficulty in regulating too soon, because we're not exactly sure how we're regulating and what we're going to stifle. What I am very much in favor of are national conversations. And I think that there is a real role for national conversations around core issues that can be run out of certain entities within the executive branch of the federal government that can actually do deep studies, and that can actually then either do best practice guidance or actually at the appropriate time implement legislation. But the bottom line is, I would be hesitant to regulate too soon. But I do think that studying things and having national conversations. For instance, we're all talking about ethics and issues of bias. People don't all come to the table with the same kinds of ethics. And every time you've got a designer who's in a room making a design decision, that individual has come to that table with whomever they are, with the framework they were raised with. We've got a lot of cross-cultural implications. AI is coming from all over the world. Our ethical framework in the United States and in the Western world shares some characteristics and has some different characteristics from people in different parts of the world. So there is no sort of ethical framework for AI that we can come up with and impose.
And I agree that it's too early to lay down the regulatory framework, but I think a foundation of conversation is very much required today, that I think industry can participate in as well proactively.
Great. We've got a couple questions. I'm going to wrap two of them together to try to sort of answer more of these. They both sort of deal with education. One is Genevieve Smith asked a little bit about business education, what business leaders should be taught in MBA programs about AI ethics. And then Prasant Murali asks about why computer scientists right now and algorithm developers aren't sort of routinely taught ethics. These things are seen as sort of separate subjects. I'm curious if Rana, do you have a view on this? You could come from a computer science background, an academic background. What should be taught in schools at university level in these different contexts?
Yeah, so I studied computer science as an undergraduate, and as I mentioned, I did my PhD in machine learning, and I went to a liberal arts school. So when I studied computer science as an undergrad, I did do ethics, but it was completely decoupled from kind of my engineering and computer science classes. I think we absolutely need to see ethics taught and be integral to computer science and engineering programs. And it has to be part of how you design and think and deploy these technologies. It cannot be a separate thing that you learn on the side. MIT, for example, has just announced a new center for, I forget exactly what they call it, but basically a new AI kind of program. And it's designed to be multidisciplinary. So I think that's definitely moving in the right path. But we need to see more of that. And I absolutely think it's really critical.
Ritika, what do you think in terms of people coming from sort of non-engineering backgrounds? What do they need to know, and then what do the engineers need to know? IBM employs a ton of engineers. Are they being put through ethics training, AI ethics training?
Absolutely. All of our engineers go through a trust and transparency ethics program, and we take that. If you think about like what it means to actually build your AI, to be able to identify your use case, and that whole life cycle, the whole AI life cycle of a model, and what it means to actually be encapsulated as part of an application or a major process, you're talking about not just your people who are developing the technology, but a lot of business stakeholders. And so we do think it's important, and we do actually have training and coursework that is about how do you teach your clients at the business level, the line of business leaders, the managers, the people who are monitoring those applications in production. What do they need to know about ethics and AI, and what it means to actually manage that entire life cycle? So for the technologists at heart, they need to really understand what does that mean in terms of the data that they're dealing with. How do they actually detect the bias? How do they mitigate bias? But there are so many other people involved in that whole life cycle that are responsible for it as well. And that's why I do think if you look at most institutions that have AI programs today, ethics of AI coursework is a core foundation of that. Even for technologists today that come out of the market that don't have that kind of background in computer science or AI, it always gets augmented with some sort of ethics class as well. And it's why you're seeing a lot of organizations that work directly with clients, Accenture as well as IBM, we're working to develop the training, the coursework, the frameworks to be able to enable and empower the business. Because if, as we know, AI is going to be ubiquitous, it's important for all of us to be able to take that as something first class that is important to start with before we even start building out these applications that are infused with AI or these processes that are infused with AI.
Great. And Catherine, I know you were talking a little bit in your in the answer to the first question about the need for education. I'm curious, for judges who may not know very much about technology, they're sitting there looking at some recidivism score. Are they going to know what that even means or how that came about?
Well, one of the things that I do is I have been speaking broadly to judges to educate them on some of these issues. And frankly, one of the challenges is that there are so many different types of software programs that are being deployed in different places and that are being developed in different places and then licensed in. And so educating the judges as to, number one, what are these tools? What can they pick up? How is the algorithm? What does it even mean in terms of various kinds of inputs? If you exclude race, but you pick up a proxy for race, what are the implications of that? What are the implications of the data set, of an old data set? There's a tool that's being used right now across the country where the data set dates back to 2005. It's, where that's a very, very old data set. So educating the users of what does this risk score mean and what are its limitations is exceedingly important. And it's not a one-size-fits-all education because, as I am sort of alluding to, each state is going to have at the state level its own software application, but also at the federal level there's a totally different set of software that's being used. They have their own independently developed PICRA software. So the education needs to be broad and it needs to be repeated. The software applications change. And so I am very much in favor of letting people understand the limits of reliability. And that's how I think of it, which is use it, but understand the limits today of its reliability. Tomorrow we may sort of catapult ourselves into a place where it's far more reliable, but today it's got some real limitations. So use it with caution.
Right. We had a question from Elizabeth Darby, who's in the audience, about how AI can be used to address disparities in healthcare equity. Shail, do you have thoughts about this? I know you guys advise a lot of healthcare sector clients. You need to unmute again, Shail.
I do that all the time. So I think there is a definite concern about the inequities that AI has a potential to create in healthcare. And I think the solution there is really to make sure that you have the diversity in data. And I think what we're advising our clients in this space is to make sure that the data that is being used is very representative of the problem or the subjects that are being represented. And I think that is essentially the case in healthcare, is that I think there is a huge potential for misuse and underrepresentation. So I think data and diversity is going to be very important.
Great. Rana, I think you had a comment, it may have been on a previous question, but I want to let you get in there. Go ahead, please.
I think there's also one more constituent that we have to kind of put into consideration in this ecosystem in terms of learning and educating on AI literacy or ethics literacy, and that's the investment community. Investors, like as investors, make decisions on which AI companies to invest in. I think it's really paramount that the company's commitment to building and deploying ethical AI is one of the considerations of making an investment. So I feel strongly that community, we need to be having a conversation with the investment community as well.
That's a very good point. We had a question from Emma Meadows, who was, and hopefully I'll summarize this okay, but it's basically, Catherine mentioned that there isn't a consensus globally on ethics necessarily. There can be different ethics in different cultures. And while in the US, there's quite a lot of emphasis on diversity and inclusion and equity, that may not be true in other countries. And how do you kind of have a global conversation about this? I'm curious, Ritika, IBM, you're a global, US-based, but a multinational company with employees all over the world. How have you incorporated, views from different cultures into this conversation? And have you had any resistance from employees from a very different culture that says, oh, this isn't how we do things in this country or in my culture?
I think inherently, it's amazing how much the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation really is a worldwide conversation. There are potentially pockets where it's not as focused on, but I think from an artificial intelligence perspective, when it comes to bias and really inclusion, we've seen that the best teams are diverse. And diversity doesn't necessarily mean diversity in terms of the standard things that we see in terms of your male or female, or in terms of background or gender or race, but diversity can mean diversity of just the backgrounds of where you have come from and the types of backgrounds that you have. I'll tell you, some of the best data scientists that I have in my organization come from backgrounds that are completely non-technical. And I think this is a very interesting fact, because when you're thinking about technology itself, you would think about, I need the best data scientists, I need the best computer scientists to be able to work on these AI problems. Sometimes that diversity comes from the fact of the best AI technologists that I have in my organization are actually philosophy majors. Why? Because they think about these problems at the beginning. And so when we work with our clients, it isn't just in the standard areas that you think about. It is, where are the backgrounds, and how do we start having a conversation about having the diversity of the different types of backgrounds in your organization, whether that be, having technologists as well as business people, as well as people that really understand, policy reform or different types of backgrounds in philosophy. This kind of diversity is really kind of what lends itself to the diversity of, or to be able to have a more inclusive kind of AI, and what we're seeing a lot more of with our clients. And so a lot of our clients across the world are having this conversation, and it's just in different ways. I think we're doing that in the United States based on a lot of what we're seeing with the diversity, equity, and inclusion focus. But those same kind of conversations in terms of different backgrounds we're having in other cultures and other geographies as well.
Interesting. We've got a question here from Abhishek, who says that he's not in a business where they're using, computer vision, so they don't have facial recognition issues around bias and facial recognition, but they use chatbots and AI ops software in the back end. And, do the panelists think that there can be bias in these tools and that they, should be looking at this? I know Danny wanted to jump in on this first, so I'll go to him. Danny, I have a feeling of, I may know what you're going to say, but what do you think about that?
Great question, Abhishek, and the answer is absolutely. Where I actually had more direct experience with this was at my previous organization. So I was at Autodesk before, and they actually have an AI-assisted kind of customer service agent that's called Ava. And I can tell you there was a great deal of thought put into, first of all, what Ava would look like. Okay, just physical appearance to begin with, that took into account reactions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then a lot that went into tone, response time, language, all sorts of different dimensions that were constantly analyzed and revisited all the time. Because if you're using chatbots, you're still into anything that is customer facing, is something where diversity is very directly implicated. And so I would say that if you're not looking at it or thinking about it right now, it's something that I'm sure everyone on this panel would highly encourage you and in your organization to do. I'm sure there are others who may have more direct experience with it also, but I feel for anything that's customer facing, it's usually absolutely something where we have to take diversity heavily into account.
Jeremy, I want to add to that because I feel so passionate about this. And of course, like at Autodesk, we helped develop Ava. But I think it's really important that like when you look at the technologies that you use, that you're really understanding how they're going through a lot of the same discussions about how to make their AI fair. Like from our perspective, every technology that we develop, whether it be our chatbots, what we do to be able to automate AI in operations or any kind of application, those are not exempt from, are you fair? Are you trustworthy? Are you secure? Are you really automating and kind of having the accountability? They are not exempt from those main questions. So when you look at your software that you're using, you have to ask those same questions because AI is definitely embedded in the software that you're using and the services that you're using. And so just as I talked about the 4 questions that we always talk about with our clients, you have to ask, is my AI fair? Is it explainable? Can I trust it? Is it accountable? Same questions apply to the software you're using. It should be no different.
And Jeremy, if I could just
Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
I was just going to say one piece that goes in with part of what Ritika was saying before in the prior question was about the philosophers being often some of the people who are coming to the table with interesting sort of perspectives on how to make fair AI. But one thing I wanted to raise is taking the AI conversation, particularly in my area, the criminal justice area, to another level, which is the philosophy matters. And we've got this is one of the places where the cross-cultural implications are really very important, because you can have certain places where a utilitarian philosophy is the philosophy that gets adopted, and that actually is very amenable to how algorithms are structured in terms of taking the majority view from a particular pattern. But in the United States, we've got a criminal justice system based upon the Rawlsian justice as fairness, which is done on a much more individual level. So looking at the philosophical background of who you're bringing to the table, I think is really very important. And it's sort of the next level. If we're going to bring sort of our ethics and bring that at writ large, that's fine. That's the meta. But then we've got to get down to what is the tradition in our particular system that we want to apply, because not all philosophy is the same. There's a lot of debate about what the applicable philosophy is that ought to be utilized with a particular tool. So I would, in the criminal justice area, say let's just take a hard look at whether we want utilitarianism or fairness as justice, because the American tradition is really fairness as justice.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Just on Abhishek's question, I mean, I want to say to Abhishek, there's been quite a lot of debate recently about these natural language processing models. There's getting a lot of traction. They're doing amazing things, and yet many of them are trained just by reading vast amounts of, or being fed vast amounts of material from the internet, and they will incorporate all the historical biases that are already incorporated in all that language. And so that could be a problem. If you have a chatbot that essentially is based off of that, it's going to potentially have some of those biases kind of baked into it. And you need to be aware of that, I guess, if you're going to use that, particularly in a customer facing way. Catherine started to answer a question Genevieve Smith also posed about, would it be better to talk about fairness versus justice versus fairness? And you started to address that a little bit, Catherine, but what do you think? I mean, would it be a better conversation if we talked about justice rather than fairness, or is fairness a broader term and it may be better in more context?
I think that it depends on what you mean by justice. I think that for certain, fairness can have one set of meanings, justice can have another. In the context of certain kinds of tools, accuracy ends up being equated with justice, and accuracy, whether or not the tool does what it's supposed to do, may not in fact be fair, because again, going back to the data, there may be structural inequalities that are built into your data set where even if the tool actually performs the way it's designed to be performed, the output may in fact be unfair. So I think that it depends on what you mean by justice, but I think that fairness for certain applications needs to be the goal. And so you've got to define what that is. What is fairness? And then you have to ask yourself whether or not you've actually got a data set that's going to allow you to get there, or whether or not you have to have a stylized data set or actually an alteration in the algorithm itself.
Interesting. We had a question from another member of the audience asking about advice for if you're building a startup and you don't have an AI ethics committee and you don't really want to appoint an AI ethics officer, but how do you try to bring these considerations to the fore and make sure that you're acting in a responsible way? Rana, you talked a little bit about this before, but I'm curious if you can offer this audience member some advice, maybe.
Yeah, hi Yasmin, and I'm happy to connect offline as well. I would say be intentional about it, prioritize it from the top, and then define a set of core values that kind of guide your decision making, and then start with baby steps. Like again, map out parts of the data and the algorithms where you think bias can be introduced, and just try to build a roadmap on how to address these issues. So start small, but be committed to it.
And I'd love to add in one more thing too, Jeremy, just real briefly.
Danny.
Framework to use is to have a set of dimensions of diversity. So if you go to, we have one, but any good diversity course will have one, and you can just use that as a framework of a set of questions you can ask yourself. Does this cut differently based on ethnicity? Does this cut differently based on ability? Does this cut differently based on the language that I speak, and so on and so forth? And you can use that as just a very simple way to kind of go through kind of a checklist of items that you may want to take into account while you're building your product.
Also, I loved your idea of a product diversity council, and if it's okay with you, I'm stealing it. So.
Absolutely, and I can talk to you about it afterwards.
Great. We had a question specifically about the recent incident at Google involving the departure of a well-known AI ethics researcher, Timnit Gebru. I've written a bit about this, but I'm curious if anybody wants to address that in any way. I mean, I maybe a little too obliquely asked about it in a way when I was asking Danny, what if you have somebody, on one of these groups that actually criticizes the product you're building and says, don't build it? How do you deal with that? I mean, it's unclear. I think, we still don't know exactly what happened in Timnit's case and why Google chose to take the actions that it did. But certainly one of the implications is she was clearly, writing research that was raising ethical considerations about and ethical criticisms of technology that Google was building. That can get kind of uncomfortable for a company. And but maybe that's also where the metal meets the road on this stuff. I mean, Danny, you said you fortunately haven't been in that situation yet, but I'm curious, if any of you want to take this, what do you do if you have a chief AI ethics officer and they start telling you, actually, this business line you're in, we don't think you should be in? I mean, Shail, what would you advise a company to do in that case? They've appointed a chief AI ethics officer, and the AI ethics officer says, this whole market, you've got a lot of police customers, but I don't think we should serve those guys anymore until they clean up their act. I mean, what would you advise a client to do in that case?
I think it's a real test of your conviction in your values, the mission that you set for the company. So I think it becomes a real test, and I think how a company decides that question is going to foretell, for a long time, the true strength of the company. I would say. There was another case that I know. There's a company called Clarify, as you know, right? The company that does face recognition, and they said they were going to put in a chief ethics officer, and then a couple of months later they decided they're not going to do that because putting that officer in place is going to be in contradiction with their purpose, which is what they wanted to pursue using FRT in military space, if you will. So I think it's a true test, and I would say, what I would advise to the clients is you have to decide for once for all as to where your convictions are.
Great. Unfortunately, we have a lot of great questions, so we're not going to be able to get to you. But we're out of time, and I want to thank everybody very much for joining us. I want to thank our speakers, Rana, Catherine, Danny, Ritika, and Shale. And thanks again to our presenting sponsor, Accenture. We enjoyed being with you, and we hope to be with you again soon. And we hope to see you in person in November in Boston. In the meantime, please take care and be safe. Thanks, everybody.